That's a good afternoon, and it's our very first podcast. We've been, as you know, creating the YouTube channel, trying to get it obviously up and running and working. And now we're starting to see a lot more people visiting YouTube. We thought it'd be a nice time now to introduce the podcast. Podcast is going to drive a lot of things forward, but we're going to put it on the website as well. So we'll be able to watch the weekly podcast, and we'll have different topics and different areas on that. The particular area I want to talk about today is the challenges in global trade as we're seeing, particularly in the geopolitics side, and just to give people a good understanding of what's around them. The things really to understand and be aware of, because under your supply chain, a lot of people don't understand if you've not been in supply chain or you're in a manufacturer or you're just a wholesaler. A lot of these things that go on beyond our control have huge effects on our supply chain exposure. So I'll talk a lot about exposure, a lot about challenges. And as an exporter, when we're as a manufacturer now wanting to export globally, it creates a lot of challenges within itself. So again, I'll explain that. I'll put some slides up because rather than me going on and on with myself, I just thought I'll put some slides up. I'm going to get some guests on, but we just thought we'll start with a general, topic that I think is in everybody's um, kind of forefront at the moment and a pure understanding. We're seeing it now at the forecourts. I filled the car yesterday and was hit with, I think it was 168 or something. It was crazy. We're going to talk about geopolitics and global supply chain. That's going to be our topics on podcast. It's not going to be political or anything. It's going to be very much on the topics that really affect you as a supplier, or if you're an exporter or a manufacturer, or you're in the freight forwarding side and you just want a better understanding, or you're in banking or anything and you need to understand what does geopolitics mean? And what is geopolitics and all these key things around that. Geopolitics is things that you can't control because governments, and you've seen this last year with the US administration putting in tariffs there, very unhappy the way that the US they felt was very much taken taken advantage of, as they would explain it. Whether you agree or disagree, that's what they thought, and they decided to start putting different tariffs in there to balance things up because historically much bigger importer of goods than exporter, and the same with the UK here where I am. And again, it has a huge effect on things when you look, and that's created a lot of income into the US, whether it's the right way or the wrong way. What it did in one thing, it started to get a lot of people or a lot of countries to start to understand their exposure, as we call the export or supply chain or the trade exposure. And there's some key things I wanted to talk about today in our podcast. Just to, again, like I said, we're going to have some guests on the next couple of weeks. But trade wars, what is a trade war? A trade war is where a country decides, and you could have big enough to do this. Obviously, if you're a small country, you're probably not going to have a huge effect. But what obviously the US administration did, they decided to start looking at products coming in and should there be anything. And one of the things around this, and we'll talk a lot about this as we go along, and so I've been highlighting for a long time now in trade, is BRICS. BRICS being introduced and now starting to really go forward, but again, it's stuttering a little bit, obviously, with all the crises what's going on at the moment. But the BRICS was introduced to allow kind of another challenge to the dominance of the US. Obviously, the US is very frightened of the China, but I think they're more frightened of BRICS because BRICS combined is countries combined, so it's a trade organization or countries that sit within that trade deal. Like the EU would have 26 members in there. And BRICS is similar, but BRICS has some real powerhouses in this. So it'll have China in there, it'll have Brazil in there, it'll have India in there, it'll have Russia in there, it'll have South Africa in there. So it really is, which accounts for around 50 odd percent of world trade. So they wanted to shift that pattern, have a bit more control. And ultimately, they didn't want to deal in dollars, and they wanted to deal in their own currencies. And obviously, the US was kind of slow in the uptake on this and allowed this to start growing. And I think obviously with the new administration, he's trying to put a stop to that, but probably a little bit too aggressive. But how far do you take it when we're talking about being aggressive? He knew there's a real shift in pattern within trade, and obviously as the big powerhouse as the US, as you would expect, they need to have still that global dominance, and they're seeing that being eroded, not just with China, but with other countries within India. And you're seeing a lot of things happening within that. So again, keep watching this space. We will delve into more topics on here, and we will get guests on to discuss it. But again, the US, is it in a good state, bad state? We don't know now with obviously what's happened with Iran just recently. It's a crazy world we live in at the moment, as I always say. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be talking about geopolitics as much as I've been in trade a long time and advising and doing courses and training. I've talked a lot about BRICS, and people are probably like, yeah, Richard, off you go again. But I've really seen that it's been a real challenge, and it was interesting to see how he would challenge that. Um, and like I said, very aggressively. And we'll see what happens and how that pans out in the future as we go along. But obviously, one of the key things everybody's talking about is oil and energy and the cost of moving goods. Anything like crisis or anything has a huge effect because ultimately, it's trade. Everything trades. Everything goes on ships. People say, well, why can't we just do it by air freight or can't we do it by road? Well, first of all, shipping by vessels is a much cheaper and cleaner way of moving goods. Air freight is a great way of moving goods very quickly, but it's very expensive. What happens if you've got like a full container? You can't just suddenly put that in a ship. So again, sorry, in an air freight carrier, it's going to cost you an absolute arm and leg. And being competitive in the market is one of the reasons why a lot of people ship on the sea. But again, it takes a long time. And now we're seeing obviously a lot of the Straits Hammers and all these issues around, how far these vessels, because we had last year within China, remember the China when we had the problems where they had to go through the Land of Good Hope rather than going through its usual straits, because obviously there was piracy and other things happening there. Again, that has a huge effect. It can delay, when you think of a global supply chain, like I don't know, like a Tesco's or an IKEA or the car manufacturing, you everything's just in time, everything's planned. Clothing, M&S and people like everything's planned. You're planning months and months in advance, in advance. But what happens if suddenly something's shifted? So they're ready to start receiving goods probably this month. And the whole shift in everything that what's happened, because all of a sudden there are certain things that can't happen. And people say, well, it's only oil. But yeah, but it has a huge effect because oil, 20% of the oil, as we know, comes from that Hammer Strait. So again, it causes a great challenge to a lot of businesses. And it's just once you start to understand how supply chain works, it's not just physically ordering goods, delivering goods, selling goods, etc. It's a whole supply chain exposure you have to think about. And then you've got sustainability, you've got all these things to really consider. So again, some huge challenges there is what we're seeing. Again, shipping routes are just put on here, serving trust for oil. Global trade moves by sea, making it maritime choke points critical. Again, somebody said recently, just divert them and then unload the vessel. But a lot of containers need a lot of trailers, and you imagine that a lot of these trailers going through certain parts of some of these places. I wouldn't even know how safe the roads are. I'm not saying they're unsafe, but could they handle thousands and thousands of vehicles? So again, this is why we use these huge shipping lanes. Suez Canal, as we saw recently, remember a few years ago, where that one of the vessels got stuck. Remember, it got stuck sideways, and that delayed things about 2 or 3 weeks. That had huge effects. Something so simple. Panama Canal, and then you've got the South China Sea. So you've got lots of things. Urgent risk situation involving the Strait of Hormuz is going to be. That's not going away. I can't see that going away. So it'd be interesting to see how rerouting, resilience of, how much stockpile have we got? Is the situation with oil and cost and everything else going to affect? Because ultimately, if that's passed on within the supply chain, that will be passed on somewhere. So ultimately, the consumer pays for that. Will the consumer pay for it? That's the other challenge. I think, consumers are getting a lot more resilient now and starting to refuse to start paying, just accepting a lot of these costs. Sometimes I'm critical of how costs suddenly just rise overnight. They never come down, do they? You ever seen that in forecourts? I mean, they'll go up to 168, 170. And I bet you bottom dollar will take an eternity to come back down. Somebody will probably argue that point. Please feel free to argue it. But I do think there's a lot of profiteering made out of a lot of these situations. Iran, the critical variable. So Iran controls the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz. So any escalation will have a huge effect. Now we know that there's things happening there, but I think there's a lot of talk, and whether actually things are happening, it'd be interesting to see. We'll see that happening, and we'll see how that pans out. Be interesting. Again, as an exporter, these are the key things to be thinking about. So if you're importing, a lot of people say, well, I'm an exporter, it doesn't affect me. Of course it does. Because if you're an exporter, unless you're purely wholesale, you bring goods in and sell it, where are you bringing them goods in from? They're coming in from China and other places, or Middle East and other areas. Well, you've got a huge disruption there. Whether you like it or not, that's the reality. The other thing is to think about is if you're a manufacturer, where are you sourcing them goods from? Somebody will argue and say, well, I source it from the UK. Yeah, but where are them UK sourcing it from? There's a huge exposure there. They might be in the same situation as other people from the GCC countries. So again, thinking about that, looking at start to map out your supply chain, not just for your exports, for your imports, from how your raw material and other stuff come in. Shipping disruptions, there's going to be cost in there. There's going to be bottlenecks. There's going to be, less containers coming, so not as many containers going out because obviously they're stuck or they're sitting around, and that is a huge effect on everybody. Energy prices, again, it's so frustrating we can't control. It'd be interesting to see at what level they go to. And our geopolitical, constant conflicts we've seen in the last few years. It's very frustrating. We need some stability. We've got a lot of instability. And again, we're going to delve into a lot of them areas as we talk about the channel. But today was just to say we're here, we're launching, we're ready to launch, we're excited. We've got some great topics, some great guests that we're going to be having on, which is really exciting. And again, please give us your feedback. It's very important. Or if there's things you want to discuss, if there's things that you find really interesting. I like listening to podcasts. I do listen to podcasts and I enjoy them. And so, it's like everything else. It's keeping it relevant to what we're doing. And international trade is very niche, but actually it plays a huge role. And once you start to understand it and get your head around it, actually there are a lot of opportunities within that. So again, as an exporter, keep watching the channel, because this will start getting you ahead of the game, especially in sales. Start to understand the challenges, what you need to be thinking about, how you can sell your goods to places. Very important. So again, strategy. I talk and talk and go on and on with myself about strategy, but I do a lot of strategy myself, and I know it works. I know it works because I'm doing a lot of that within AI and other tools that I've been setting up and creating. And your strategy is very clear, you've got to keep to it. It's very difficult sometimes, but it's very important. So we are going to put this on the website. It's going to be in the news hub on the website, and it's going to be delivered in there every week. Please sign up to the YouTube channel. Been really good. It's new, like I said. We're starting to get quite a lot of views now, but we need some subscribers, which is always nice. And again, be first to be listening to our podcast. Next week we'll be doing our new podcast, and again we'll be talking about some interesting topics. But again, anybody's got topics, let us know. Let us know what you think and what you'd like to see, and we'll see you hopefully, as we said, on the next podcast. But thanks for joining us. It was nice and quick today, and we'll see you next week. And thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.